Hello, everybody. Welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. I have two projects of mixed media that are intersecting today. I have the blog post for my creative team assignment over at scraphappy.org, and I'm here with the Mix It Up Monday Mixed Media Social Hop. So these things are going to combine together today in some lovely watercolor goodness. I want to share lots of tips and tricks on some watercolor techniques, so let's go ahead and dive in. Mix It Up Monday always starts with a sketch, and this sketch, as I pop it up on screen, had lots of blocks of patterns, and this totally reminded me of a watercolor class that I recently taught with blocks of color. So I'm going to tell the story of teaching that class as well as using the watercolor techniques that I used in that class. For anyone who's new to watercoloring, you should get a watercolor paper. I use this Strathmore 400 series, but use what you've got. This comes in larger sheets and I do have to cut it down, but we'll use the excess for some embellishments. I have this very mini metallic paint set from Crafter's Companion that is new to me, so I'm not experienced with these particular paints. I do like a double pot of water because I keep one cleaner and one for rinsing out dirty. A towel is good for some techniques, and then I like this 3/4 inch flat brush for doing wide bands of color, which is what we're going to do today. All right, let's go ahead and talk about some of those techniques. Before I do, I need to block out the areas that I'm going to color or paint. And that is going to help me because I have a hard time keeping things even and straight. So I'm going to use a ruler, and I'm laying out my photos to sit on top of those blocks of pattern from the sketch. And I'm going to create pattern instead of blocks of paper. I'm going to create it with blocks of watercolor. So we're going to add the color and we're going to add the pattern. I try to keep my pencil markings very light so that they are easier to erase. And just know that if you paint over the pencil marks, they will be trapped and you won't be able to erase them. So I gave myself enough margin so that I can paint near the pencil line without going over it. All right, and the first thing we're going to do with this is just do a wash of color. And that is basically just the basics of painting. We're going to pick up some paint on our paintbrush. You have to get your paint nice and wet to get it to activate and be ready to paint with. I like to use a little tray off to the side to help spread out the paint into my bristles and dilute it down with water until it is the color that I want. And then I am just going to start painting. I liked the curved edges of the paper blocks in the sketch, so I'm going to go ahead and curve my edges with this paintbrush, and this nice wide paintbrush helps me do that job. As I'm working with this first block of color, I want to remind you that watercolor starts to dry the moment you put it onto your paper, and watercolor will behave differently depending on how wet or how dry it is. So you will see me continuing to make brush strokes across other parts of the area that I've already painted, and that is so that I can keep everything kind of evenly moist. And as I do this, I am picking up more color and bringing in more color to this block. One important thing to know about watercolor is that when it dries, it lightens up. So if you like the color tone on the paper as you see it, you're going to want to add more color because it will dry lighter. The sketch had some banners up in the corner, and I'm going to recreate those. And I'm going to do a technique called lifting. So I paint down the wet paint, and while it's still wet, I dry off my brush on my towel, touch it to the paint, and it will lift up the paint to leave pattern behind. In this case, I just made simple stripes with the straight edge of my brush. For this next block, I am putting down a very light tint of color, and that really is just to give me the size and shape that I'm going to add pattern to. I will let that dry before I add pattern over the top, but here you can see it's just a haze of color. So you will notice that I am jumping around with this project, and that's because I will let some areas dry while I work on other areas, making sure that I'm working where I'm not going to set my hand down in something that's already wet. Okay, for this next technique, I do have a wet stripe of that yellow down there, and I'm going to add more wet paint into that, and that's called the wet on wet technique. And depending how much water you have on your paper and how much water and color you have in your brush, it will behave differently. So if you haven't done this before, I would recommend practicing with semi-dry paint on paper and paint on brush, and then really, really wet paint on paper and paint on brush, and see how the different behavior is. Basically, the more wet it is, the more it's going to move the pigment around and spread and blend. All right, that upper haze section that I painted is dry now, and I am going to add a plaid pattern to it. One of the pattern papers on the inspiration had plaid on it, and I'm going to paint it. Of course, you can paint an entire sheet of pattern, but starting off with smaller blocks is going to help you practice. And I learn something new every time I do this. I'm not an artist, but I am artful, and I keep playing, and I keep practicing, and I keep learning. Here I am, I've reversed the paper, and I'm going the opposite direction with another color. I did not let those blue stripes dry, so as the pink color interacts with the wet blue color, it is going to create some blending and give me kind of a purple tone. Now this block down here at the bottom is completely dry, and I am adding just tiny little droplets of gold paint on top of that, so it's not going to interact with the paint below. You should know that if you have a dry watercolor and you add wet watercolor on top of it, it will reactivate the dry color and cause more mixing, moving, and blending. So you have to know how paint behaves in order to get the results that you want. So there I'm just adding small drops of color on top. Here I am using the flat edge of my brush and creating little star shapes, which I'm trying to make look like flowers. So that's the idea here. And if they're getting a little too straight or blobby, I will kind of circle up the end a little bit to make them a little more round. All right, here is another wet on wet. I'm going to put down a damp layer of color on the bottom, and then I'm going to use the edge of my brush to add a darker layer of pigment in stripes, and those stripes will bleed and soften into the background and create a nice little stripy pattern paper. All right, if you have little mistakes outside your edges, most of the time you can wet it with clean water and dab it up with a clean towel and erase your mistakes most of the time. Some pigments will be more stubborn than others. Reds tend to be more stubborn in general, but watercolor can be forgiving if you're making mistakes. All right, once that blue stripe of banner up there is dry, I'm adding another piece behind it. So when you're layering watercolor, you have to start with the stuff in front and then add the stuff around it to make it look like it's in the back. So I'm very carefully painting right up to the edge of that blue, and I do have quite a lot of water in my paintbrush this time. And one thing that I like about watercolor is if you have more water and more pigment in your paint zone, you can tip your paper to move it around, but you can also tip it to let gravity pull it to one side and then leave it to dry, and that will create nice hard lines. And I like some of that look in my watercolor. All right, I've stepped aside to pause a little bit while that is propped up on a towel to let gravity do its job. And I look at other areas and decide where my photos are going to go and how big I want my photos to be. Things still weren't dry at that point, so I have no problem using a heat tool. Using a heat tool will change how your paint moves and interacts with the other paint as it's drying. So just know that if you want to use a heat tool, you can, and it will change your results slightly. All right, once it is completely dry, I touched it to make sure it didn't feel cool to the touch, so I knew that it was dry, and I could erase all those pencil lines. Now that I have a good structure in place, anything else that I add will have boundaries for me to visually work with. All right, what else am I adding? I wanted to add more color blocks to the centers of these. The sketch had 3 blocks of color. I have 3 blocks of color, but they're uneven blocks because I wanted my photos to fit. And with this block down here, I am doing wet on wet again. My paint on my paper is fairly wet, and I'm adding clear drops of plain water that are very wet. And you can see what that result looks like. That is called blooming. All right, here is one tip for you. When I'm working on bigger zones of color, I do like to activate my paint and create puddles of paint on a palette so that I know that I have paint that's just ready to go in kind of the consistency that I know I want. Because if you add more water to watercolor paints, you're going to get a lighter color. And if you add less water or you have more paint, you're going to have a darker color. So if I want some consistency, I can create puddles that I know are going to be even across a paint job. So I have those puddles ready because I'm going to create a ribbon. And I'm going to do that by using the shape of my paintbrush to create little rectangular blocks. And I'm slowing this one down a little bit more because I like this one the most. So I am just touching the tip of my flat brush to the paper and just slightly dragging it back a little bit to create a little rectangle. And I'm going to try and keep my little rectangles the same shape and size. The width of the brush is going to help me keep them the same height, and pulling back the rectangle to the right size is going to be a little bit of a challenge. And I can add more paint to that block. If it's not looking dark enough, I can tap, tap, tap the paint around the block to help even out the color. And I did get fresh water in my pot for this because I knew I was going to be rinsing a lot to change colors every time, because I'm going to make each stripe of this little block be a different color. All right, speeding this up a little bit, I'm going to continue this same process with my other colors. And I just wanted to say another good reason to create puddles of color on your paint palette is if you want to mix a custom color. I mixed the orange there with the yellow and pink from my palette. And so I wanted to make sure I had enough of that mix that I wouldn't run out, because if you're mixing colors, it's really, really hard to get the exact same color when you mix another puddle. All right, I have done both sides of this paper, and I put my photo over to measure it because I know I don't need to paint the whole entire middle, but I didn't paint enough stripes, so I'm going to go ahead and add one more stripe to each side. And then I let that dry. But I am not done with this stripy ribbon yet. I'm going to connect those stripes with some gold. Now, sometimes your paints don't have a lot of pigment to them, and that was the case with this gold. So instead of making a puddle of paint, I put a lot of water on the paint tray and let it get gooey so that I could get the saturation of color that I wanted. Good, high quality, more expensive watercolor paints will have more pigment to them, and you won't have to do that trick, but these ones are not that kind of paint. Okay, let's make some embellishments. Here I'm just making some flowers, and I just create little cat's eye shapes, and I put 5 of them next to each other in a circle, and that makes a flower. I will fussy cut them out, but if you don't want to do that, another way to watercolor your embellishments is to paint a swath of color onto a scrap piece and then die cut it out. Here I'm die cutting out leaves, and then I'm using that cat's eye idea again to cut out extra leaves, but those are different ways that you can incorporate watercoloring. If you don't want to paint images, you can use the paint and then die cut the images. All right, here I am hand painting my title. I know not everybody's comfortable with this, but if you want a good tip, I can link you up to video where I talk about how to love your handwriting and watercolor with it as well. All right, after giving it a little trim, my title is done. My papers are dry. I added more details to certain areas, and so I feel like it is ready. With all my parts and pieces in front of me, I'm ready to assemble. I ink the edges of my photo and pop it up on foam tape because I think that helps give it separation from the background. And I will add my title. And then I'm going to create clusters of flowers, which was part of the sketch. And I just made my own flowers, both with hand painting and with die cutting. And once my cluster of flowers are built, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of detail with a pen. I do some little stipple dots around the centers of the flowers and some lines along the leafy edges. And I use my favorite VersaFine black ink to stamp my journaling lines. And I will stamp some on the opposite side as well because I tend to journal plenty, and that will give me room for all my words. And then here is a final look at how everything came out. That one there that I just pointed at reminds me both of Cheetah and a Band-Aid. So I'm not sure I quite like that one. But, you know, like I said, every time you learn something new. All right, that is it for me this time. If you want to check out the blog post associated with this over at Scrap Happy, I will leave you the link below. Don't forget that this is also a hop for the Mix It Up Monday group, so be sure to check out that whole list and go support all the other crafters. I really hope you enjoyed watching me watercolor and being artful. And as I say, you don't have to be an artist. I'm not an artist, but everyone can be artful. So until I'm back with you next time, I hope you have an artful day.